So what I was saying was, if you're a person who thinks that for the typological connection, you need a New Testament passage, then you should be consistent and also say you need a New Testament passage for the moral reading, right? So, for instance, what you guys did Genesis 37, right? So I don't know of any New Testament passage that reads that text and says, "Don't be jealous like the brothers." Right? I don't know of any New Testament passage that gives a moral reading to that text. So I was just saying that people should be consistent. If you think that spiritual readings need New Testament passages, then do that with every passage. If you don't think that, then and the New Testament authors just give you a grid, it gives you a lot more freedom. And that's what I was advocating for in the class, is that the New Testament authors give you a grid of faith, hope, and love. And we use the general ideas that we find in the New Testament to help us read those Old Testament passages, but we don't necessarily need like a one-for-one. Like Joseph's brothers were jealous, don't be jealous. Joseph went into the pit, Jesus, went down to earth and was humiliated. We don't need a one-for-one for everything, I think. Yeah, what do you think? Yeah, no. That's a great distinction. So this distinction would be, like, don't add more laws to God's laws. So for instance, if you see Gideon tying the foxes together, right? It was Gideon or Samson? Samson ties the tails of the foxes together. I probably wouldn't preach that and say, don't tie the tails of foxes together, because the Bible doesn't tell me not to do that, right? That'd be adding to God's law, right? But what I'm saying is, like for 1 John, so 1 John says, don't be like Cain, right? So that's a clear New Testament author interpreting that text in a moral way. But I don't think we have to have a New Testament author interpret that text in a moral way for us to interpret it in a moral way. But we can say, now, remember, Paul does say don't be jealous, and these stories, these narrative actually give us a picture of what jealousy can look like. And do you realize the end of jealousy? The end of jealousy is betrayal. Do you realize the end of jealousy in this instance is lying, covering up, trying to murder? This is your potential outcome. Don't be like those brothers, right? But I'm not adding to God's law. I'm using this story as an illustration of one of God's laws, right? So that's what I was saying. Does that make sense? That's a really fine line. I'm glad you asked that. But does that bring clarity? Good. But I don't think we need a New Testament author to make that moral application in order for us to be allowed to make it, right? But I do think we shouldn't be adding new laws, right? So we should find a way in which God has already commanded, do this or don't do this. And through that grid, we're reading that lens. That's great. Okay, when you think about doing typological readings for the first time, it can certainly be fearful because you don't want to put words in God's mouth. You don't want to say things that aren't intended, right? But in one sense, the only way to grow into it is by trying it, right? Imagine you want to learn how to ride a bike, and you say, I'm afraid that I'm going to do it imperfectly, and so I'm never going to try until I'm ready to do it perfectly. Well, that doesn't work, right? You're going to fall over, you're going to skin your knees, you're going to make bad connections, but that's part of the learning process. All of that's part of the learning process. Just like learning how to walk. Falling over is not a failure. It's learning how to walk, No one laughs at a 2-year-old because they fall over. People laugh at 30-year-olds for falling over. People don't laugh at 2-year-olds, and people don't laugh at 80-year-olds for falling over, though, right? It takes time. If you think about it like this, though, so if there's leaning, if you could lean one way and fall over, or lean the other way and fall over, and one side is not making enough connections to Christ, because the Bible is saying Christ is in this text. See him in this text, okay? Leaning the other way is I'm seeing Christ in ways that I'm not making legitimate connections to the New Testament, right? I'm allegorizing more than I'm doing typology, okay? And you could fall over one way, you could fall over the other way. Which way do you all think yourself and most of the sermons you hear are leaning? Are you leaning more towards this way, not hearing all the connections that could be made, or leaning more this way and hearing more illegitimate connections? I think most people are leaning this way. So here's my encouragement. The only way to find balance is to start leaning this way, right? And as you do start leaning this way, you may lean too far at times, but then you'll come back and you'll find balance again. Hermeneutics is an art and a science, and it's messy sometimes, but you'll get it. Yeah, don't be afraid. It's part of the process. Good. Well, let's do this then. There's much more that could be said. I wanted to transition one moment to listen to Moondog's Canon in C once again that we listened to at the beginning. So remember the hermeneutics that I gave you for listening to it, right? So a canon allows you the melody repeats. There are different instruments kind of fighting for the melody. We're going to listen to it in its entirety this time, and I want you to tell me, did you hear something new the second time that you didn't hear the first time? And if so, how does that apply to hermeneutics? How does the experience of listening to the song the second time, what does it teach you about hermeneutics? Okay, we'll listen to it again. That's good. Hermeneutics is like that, okay? You got to read the Bible again and again and again, and you will hear who is taking the melody at that time. Good. So I want to finish up these lectures for the course just by covering some things that are a bit more. We said it's an art and a science. We need to cover a few things that are a bit more on the science side of hermeneutics. We started with the theology of hermeneutics, and then we went into a bit of the art of hermeneutics, and now there's some things just regards the science of hermeneutics that we do need to cover, and these will help you in your future classes significantly. And so I want to take a bit of time to think about literary devices. Just in general, when we think about literary devices as a good application of our doctrine of God, as a good application of our doctrine of revelation, we have to say that any literary devices that we come across in the Bible or even other literature exists because they exist in the mind of God first, right? So things like poetry, plot, even protagonists and antagonists, these were not things that people came up with as ways to describe what the world is like or ways to describe good literary structures or good books. No, they existed in the mind of God first, which is why the Bible contains them. This is why other works of literature contain them as well, because we, as people made in the image of God, reflect God, God the creator, God the ultimate story writer, as we seek to communicate well. And so I want to think about a few different literary devices that I think will help us as we approach the scriptures, just to be aware of what's happening in the stories. So the first thing I want to consider is plot. Okay, plot. What is plot? Can someone give me a definition of plot? Anyone know? How about this? We watch it, let's say we watch it, tonight is movie night for my family. Friday night is movie night and pizza night. And we love pizza and movie night. We set up the projector and we do a double feature. So we do a kids movie and the kids go to bed, and then we watch something that my wife and I enjoy more. So tonight is movie night, and if after the movie was over, I went to my wife and I said to her, "What did you think about the plot?" Or "What was the plot?" Right? What would I be asking her? Yeah, what's the main storyline? Very good. And so in general literary theory, there's two kinds of plots, okay? So the definition of plot would be the order of events arranged by the author to provide a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end. So usually there's two kinds. There's understood to be two kinds of plots. There's more than this, but just to think of these two, these are very helpful. These will be very helpful categories for you as you think about preaching, as you think about different texts that you're seeking to exegete, what kind of story is this? Is this a tragedy, which is a story that moves from prosperity to catastrophe? Or is it a comedy, which is a story that has a happy ending? So a comedy isn't necessarily something that's funny. It just means it has a happy ending. Now, it typically begins in prosperity, then goes into tragedy, and ends happy. But it could be happy all the way along. It could start in tragedy and then end in prosperity. But basically, the question of tragedy versus comedy is, does the story have a happy ending or a sad ending? A happy ending or a sad ending? So let's get out our Bibles real quick and go to Exodus 32. I'll get my Bible. So let's go to Exodus 32, and I want you to just glance over it. Is Exodus 32 a comedy or a tragedy? And then defend your answer. Tell me why you think it's a comedy, or tell me why you think it's a tragedy. It's the golden calf story, right? Remember what happens in the golden calf story? Yeah. What? Yeah, it's a tragedy, right? So it starts, the golden calf story starts with people noticing that Moses is delaying, and it ends with death and destruction, things like that. And it ends at the very last verse of the Lord sending a plague on the people. It's a tragedy. How about the book of Job? Job. Job's a comedy. That's exactly right. Job is not a tragedy. Job's a comedy. Job starts in prosperity and then descends into calamity, and then it ends in prosperity once again. Job has a happy ending, right? No? Do you think Job has a happy ending? Okay. So it's a comedy. It's not a tragedy.
So it's the comedy according to this definition.
Yeah. Yeah. So these are the classic definitions, right? So a tragedy has a sad ending, a comedy has a happy ending. The book of Judges, comedy or tragedy? Tragedy is exactly right. It ends with the story of the Benjamite and the Civil War and things like that. Could you argue that it is a comedy? Judges. Is there any way to argue that it's a comedy? What's the very last story in Judges? Remember, the people of Benjamin look like they're going to die, and then the Lord provides wives for them. So the Benjamites are able to continue to live. It's possible it's a comedy, depending on how you read that story. Like, are they finding wives in unfaithfulness, or is the Lord just providing wives for them in His grace? In a sense, I do think the story of Benjamin's, you could say, death and then resurrection, is a bit of a comedy, actually. They've been unfaithful, and in the very end, the Lord provides wives for the Benjamites. But then the very last verse does say, in this time, in these days, there was no king, and the people did what was right in their own eyes. I think the book of Judges could be argued either way. It could be argued either way. But the last verse is certainly the ominous note in the book of Judges. How about the gospel stories? Tragedies or comedies? Comedies, that's exactly right, because it ends with the resurrection of Jesus. It looks like it's going to be a tragedy, but it ends with the resurrection of Jesus. Good. Let's think then about, so these are two overall options for plots, tragedy versus comedy, and the question that's being asked is happy ending or sad ending. These are the different elements of a plot, okay? These are the different elements of a plot. So plots always start with exposition. It just tells you what's normal, okay? Something is normal, and the normal, it has to tell you what's normal in order for the conflict to have any meaning, right? If you're just thrown into a story and you're not told what normal life is like, then the conflict has no meaning, has no significance, right? Because you're just thrown into a conflict, and that's just all that has ever existed. And then you have a moment called the inciting moment. And the inciting moment comes in, and it changes everything, right? It's a moment in which what was normal now becomes not normal. And that inciting moment in the story is what will drive the conflict that is going to slowly increase throughout the story, okay? Until the conflict reaches its climax, which is usually where the good guy and the bad guy have the final showdown, right? The big good guy and the big bad guy fight, something like that. Or we find out will the man and the woman actually get married at the end, right? Your typical romance story follows that pattern, right? Where what's normal is that you have women who don't have any prospects of a husband. Then the man shows up, which is the inciting moment. The conflict is, it looks like they're trying to get together, and then everyone has the exact same story. He says something or she says something, and then now they don't. Now you're wondering, will they actually get married? And the climax happens when they resolve it. Or if you think about Lord of the Rings or some kind of fantasy movie like the Marvel movies, there's some kind of normalcy. The normalcy might be like Captain America Civil War, where everyone is in conflict with one another, but then there's an inciting moment where you wonder maybe they will be actually disunited forever, leading to the climax of the final showdown, the final battle, where then they end up resolving differences, right? Every good story follows these kinds of structures. After the climax, it usually has some kind of time for falling action. It doesn't hit the climax and then immediately the movie's over. Rather, it hits the climax and then it kind of wraps up other things, right? There's a main conflict, but there's other little things that are happening at the same time. And those little things have to be wrapped up as well. And then finally, there's a resolution, which I've listed that resolution. It's not on the same line, you notice, as the exposition. It's a new normal. Life is normal again, but life could never look like it did back at the beginning. Life could never look like that again. So let's think about this in terms of the Bible. Talk to the person next to you. Where do we see, what are the chapters? If you were to assign different chapters or sections of the Bible to these elements of plot, where would you put them? So talk to the person next to you about that for just a moment. What chapters would you list in these sections? Yeah, so these different elements on the plot graph, what chapters or sections of the Bible could you assign to these different elements on the plot graph? Yeah, the whole Bible. Yeah, looking at the whole story of the Bible. Okay, I'll share with you what I think. So Genesis 1 through 3 or Genesis 1 and 2, right, is telling you how what normal life is like, what the normal events are like. And then Genesis 3 is the inciting moment, right? So Genesis 3 comes in, there's a snake that slithers in, there's a temptation, and everything changes. Then the conflict is building between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent from Genesis all the way through the gospel stories until you get to the crucifixion moment. Or when I say crucifixion, I mean crucifixion / resurrection / ascension, right? Those moments are the climax of the story. The falling action then would be Acts through Revelation 20, as all the other things are getting wrapped up, basically, right? And then the new normal would be Revelation 21 through 22. But the climactic battle, the big battle scene, right, where the bad guy and the good guy are fighting, the Bible describes that, the decisive moment, as the crucifixion event. Let's move to 1 Samuel 1. I want you to think about 1 Samuel 1. So think about this in your groups. What is the plot? How would you graph the plot of 1 Samuel 1? What verses would you put in the different sections in 1 Samuel 1? What's the main conflict of 1 Samuel 1? Yeah, Hannah's barrenness. Good. So, yeah, that's the main conflict for sure. So then what's the exposition? 1 through 5. So then what's the inciting moment? Verse 6. I'd put that under conflict, actually. Yeah, I'd put that. So the main conflict is not Hannah and Peninnah. The main conflict is, will Hannah have children? So I would actually push it further back. So I'd put the exposition in verses 1 and 2, and I would say the conflict, the inciting moment, is introduced when it says Hannah has no children. Yeah, her barrenness. That's what gets resolved at the end, and that's what drives everything. The story begins by just setting up. Yeah, there's this man, and he has 2 wives, and they go up every year for the sacrifices, and blah 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 blah. And one of the wives has no children. Okay, now I know what the conflict is. Does that make sense? So if that's the case, so think about it for the next moment. Then what's the rising action? Okay, as you're reading the text, where's the drama in the text? What would be the verses? 3 to 7 or 8? 3 to 9. Yeah, I would say to 18. That's exactly right. Yeah, the rising action is continuing all the way up until, like, Hannah is, her face is no longer sad in 18. But if the conflict is about, is she going to have a baby, it's not resolved until 19 through 20. That's why it goes into such, it's a little bit awkward, right? It's a little bit awkward when you read verse 19. That's why it goes into such detail, right? Elkanah knows Hannah, his wife, and in that moment the Lord remembers her, and then it's really long, and in due time Hannah conceived, and she bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, right? It's giving me a lot of details for the conception, pregnancy, and birth moment, right? So that would be the climax, right? So it starts with the conflict is, will she have a baby? And 19 and 20 answers that. So then how then do things get resolved? What would be the verses we mark for the falling action? There's still a few things that need to get fixed and resolved. I'd mark that as 21 through 23. Okay, which ends with her weaning him. So here she's going up, offering sacrifices, things like that. And then 24 through the end shows us what the new normal is, right? So it shows us that the new normal is that Samuel was going to be serving in the tabernacle. And he worships the Lord there. But that's not directly related to, right? The conflict is not, will Samuel be dedicated to the Lord? The conflict is, will Hannah have a child? And so then Samuel worshiping the Lord in the temple, they call it the temple, but it's the tabernacle, right? Is just part of explaining what the new normal is. Does that make sense? So some ideas for reading with plot in mind. Here are some questions you can ask. Number 1, how does the author set our expectations, and does he meet them or does he not? How does he set our expectations, and does he meet those expectations or does he not? So for instance, I list Genesis 4 here. Genesis 3 tells you that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And then what happens in Genesis 4? The woman has a child. And does he crush the head of the serpent? No, he doesn't. Right? So the story sets you up to think that Cain is going to be the good guy, but then Cain ends up being the bad guy, right? Number 2, how does the author use narrative time? So go to Genesis 3, verse 6. And look at how he tells the story here, right? So the details of the story are being given, but then chapter 3, verse 6 is a bit agonizingly slow. It's the same thing that was happening in 1 Samuel 1, right? So here, listen to how slow the story. It feels like it's happening in slow motion before you. So when the woman saw the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, that the tree was desirous to make one wise, then she took the fruit and ate and gave some to her husband who was with her, and he did eat. It's like you want to scream, don't do it, right? And he's doing that on purpose he slows down. Like that moment, if you think about it, that moment was just like and hand it to her husband. I mean, but if you read it, it feels like it's happening in slow motion in front of you. Or how does he use dialogue? How does he use narration, right? So when are specific characters speaking, or when is it just narrating the events that are happening? So Genesis 12, 1 through 4, with God's covenant with Abraham is a good example. That it's, for a while, you've just been seeing a descriptive narrative, and all of a sudden everything slows down in Genesis 12, 1 through 4, because God is directly speaking to Abraham. So those are just some general ideas about plot. Nothing terribly in depth, just general ideas for how to read in the literal sense of the text, the plot, and find the drama of the plot. Any questions on that? If not, we'll move to characters next. So characters are just simply the people in the story, right? So the people that move the plot forward, the people who are involved in the plot of the story. And there are a lot of different kinds of characters in stories. There are a lot of different kinds of characters in stories, but I just want to consider three. The protagonist, the antagonist, and the foil. So the protagonist is the most prominent character in the story. The most prominent character in the story. That does not mean that he is morally good necessarily. So Breaking Bad, right? Breaking Bad, who is the protagonist of Breaking Bad? Walter White. Is Walter White a good guy or a bad guy? He's a bad guy, but he's the protagonist of the story, right? The Count of Monte Cristo book. Who's the protagonist? Good guy or bad guy? Bad guy, right? So you can have stories where the protagonist is not necessarily the good guy, okay? So then the antagonist would be the opposite of the protagonist. So he's the one providing the most conflict between the two. Now, again, the antagonist is not necessarily the bad guy. The antagonist could be the morally good guy, but he's the one, you're not following the story from his perspective. You're always following the story from the protagonist's perspective. And then a foil is a character used to contrast the protagonist. It shows the qualities of the protagonist as either good or bad because you're contrasting the protagonist with the foil. Okay? So the foil works to show the protagonist as either really, really good or really, really bad because you have someone to compare him to. So think about 1 Samuel 17. David and Goliath, right? So there's three real main characters in this story. There's David, Goliath, and who? Saul, right? David is courageous and fights Goliath, though he's small and insignificant. Goliath is the giant, the antagonist who's serving to fight the people of God. And then Saul, what's Saul doing? First of all, remember Saul is a giant as well. Saul is a very tall man. He stands tall above all of his peers, but he's a coward, and he refuses to fight. That's why his armor doesn't fit David, right? So he's the foil of David. We see David as even more courageous because we see how cowardly Saul is. Right? So that's how Saul is serving. That's how Saul is being used in the text. Does that make sense? Pretty simple. So think about Jonah chapter 4. Okay. So what happens in Jonah chapter 4? You have Jonah, the reluctant prophet, who then goes on top of a mountain and he looks out on Nineveh. And God says, do you have a right to be angry? And he says, I have a right to be angry even unto death. And then God says, God saves the people, and Jonah says, I told you would do this because you're just like this, aren't you? You're just like this. You always save people. You always rescue people. Come on, God, get with the program. And where's the vengeance and wrath that I want? And Nineveh ends up being saved. So who's the protagonist of that story? I don't think it's God. It's Jonah. Jonah's the protagonist. He's not the good guy, but the story is being told from his perspective. Who's the antagonist in that story? God. Yeah, God's the antagonist. That doesn't mean God's the bad guy. It just means that from the perspective of Jonah, God is the one who's opposed to him. So then who's the foil? Nineveh. Nineveh's repenting. And how ironic is it that the one Israelite is left in the wilderness outside of the city where the people of God dwell. The people of God are these Gentiles, and the one Israelite in the whole story is outside of the city, right? I get the question is going to be who is the story following throughout, right? Is the story following God dealing with his wayward prophet, or is the story following a wayward prophet and his frustrations with God? Right? That's going to be the main question you have to ask, with who's the antagonist and who's the protagonist in that story. But it's a good observation. That it begins with the word of the Lord comes to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, go to Nineveh, right? That's how the story starts. So is it the story of the wayward prophet, or is it the story of God working with his wayward prophet, right? That's the question you have to ask beforehand. But yeah, good observation. Let's talk about setting. So settings are simply the time and the location where the story takes place. The time and the location where the story takes place. And there's two types of settings. There's integral settings and there's backdrop settings. So integral settings are usually well-described times and well-described locations. So you know what we're talking about. And then backdrop settings, it's a little bit unclear in respect to time or location. But there is some kind of setting. Okay, like it's clearly somewhere, but you're not exactly sure where it is. You're not exactly sure when it is. And frankly, it doesn't necessarily matter that you pinpoint on Google Maps where this is and you know the exact year. That doesn't matter as much as the fact that it's happening somewhere and you kind of know the details around it. So integral settings, for instance, Ruth chapter 1, right? During the time of the judges, there was a man in Bethlehem, and they went over the Jordan, and they went to live in Moab, and they stayed there for 10 years, right? That's the setting. That's an integral setting. It's well described in time, and it's well described in location. You know everything about what's going on and where it is. Can you think of some examples of backdrop settings in the Bible where it's a little bit unclear of the time or the setting? Job, yeah, Job is a great example. Yeah, we know it's in Uz, right? Job lives in Uz, but besides, we don't really know. Uz is a very general region. We don't exactly know where Uz is. It's a very big place, and you also don't know when it happens. But that doesn't matter to the story. The author is not really concerned about where or when. The author is more concerned with what happens. What else? Are there any other backdrop settings you can think of in the Bible? Yeah, you just have the heavens and the earth. Yeah, it's just kind of like, yeah, I guess so, right? It's kind of happening like, in some sense it's happening in like this nebulous area, but in another sense it's happening everywhere, right? Like God's in heaven, he's doing things on earth. Proverbs 7 would be a good example of a backdrop setting, I think. So you have the man who goes down the street where he knows the prostitute is going to be. Where is that street? When is he doing this? That doesn't matter. Who cares? It's the street where the brothel is, right? And you don't need a Google Maps pen to tell me exactly where that street is. The point is that street is there, right? And everyone can kind of relate to it in a general way. Parables are oftentimes like this also, where there's more of a backdrop setting. There's a farmer, there's a garden, that kind of stuff. Let's think about imagery. So imagery would just be pictures or symbols that you find throughout the Bible. So pictures or symbols that keep reoccurring. So we've mentioned a few like light, for instance. Light's a symbol that keeps reoccurring throughout the Bible. Unclean animals tend to represent Gentiles. Where do I get that from? Yeah, Peter's dream. Yeah. So Peter's dream has the vision of the unclean animals, and that represents the Gentiles. So you'll find that throughout the Bible story, that a lot of times unclean animals represent Gentiles, right? Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, so dogs are oftentimes, dogs are Gentiles. Very good. But unclean animals in general, so like donkeys a lot of times represent Gentiles, things like that. So I'll give you two categories for imagery. Number one is using vivid language to describe events, people, or ideas. Using vivid language to describe peoples, events, or ideas. So Exodus 19, verse 4. Remember how God's people are described there? You are a kingdom of priests, a royal priesthood, right? And a holy nation, right? Just before that, he says this, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Did God really bear his people on eagle's wings? No. Did he bring them to himself? In one sense, right? Because that's where Sinai is. But in another sense, no. I mean, it's a bit hyperbolic in some senses, right? Because they haven't come all the way to the promised land or Eden restored. Psalm 7 is another example of this. O Lord, my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest, like a lion, they tear my soul apart, right? But souls can't be torn apart, right? Souls are the immaterial part of you. So he's using symbolism here. They're like lions that want to tear apart my soul. It's describing his emotional state as these people are pursuing him and trying to destroy him. But they'll also use similar stories to remind you of, or they'll use stories that remind you of previous biblical stories. So they'll use stories to remind you of previous biblical stories. We already looked at Ruth 1. Right, so Ruth 1 is where Ruth says, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me, which the symbol of the hand of the Lord in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the greatest act of the hand of the Lord is in the Exodus story, where the hand of the Lord is mighty to save Israel. And Exodus 15, the people sing about the mighty hand of the Lord that delivered them, right? So when you see the hand of the Lord throughout the Bible, it's usually referring back to that Exodus story, right? So remember we looked at the story where God, or the Ark of the Covenant, is captured by the Philistines and put before Dagon, and Dagon's hands are chopped off, showing he's powerless. But then it says the hand of the Lord was mighty against the Philistines. What's the ironic thing? The ironic thing is that God has gone through another Exodus story, right? He's been captured not by the Egyptians, but by the Philistines. He's disarmed the Philistine gods, just like he disarmed the Egyptian gods, and then he delivers himself out with mighty plagues, right? He brings plagues of the boils and the rats and things like that, and after the mighty plagues, he delivers himself out of the Philistine territory. So the point there is God doesn't need anyone to save him. God's fully capable of saving himself. Right? But then there's ironic uses of those same images. So for instance, think about Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Right? Remember that story where Rehoboam says, compares himself to Pharaoh. Right? And then people compare him to Pharaoh. So he says that he's going to make the people of Israel's work even harder. Remember this? So he says that he says if my father scourge you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. And he says that he will double their work, which is reminiscent of Pharaoh. And then he says that his pinky, or what does he say? My pinky finger is bigger than my thigh, right? What's the exact quote? It is. It's dirty language, actually. Let me find it. It's in 1 Kings, right? Earlier before this before Asa. Here we go. Solomon turns in chapter 11, Rehoboam's folly. The people come to him for advice. Lighten the load. Here we go. My little finger shall be thicker than my father's thigh. Yeah, that's right. My little finger will be thicker than my father's thigh. The little finger is a euphemism. It's his penis. He says it'll be thicker than my father's thigh. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm like, you think that your work was hard before, your work's going to be even harder now. Then what is Jeroboam? Jeroboam, it looks like this new Moses figure who's coming to deliver the people and bring them, and he goes out into the wilderness, right? But he actually ends up being a bad guy. He's a foil to Moses. You would think he's going to be, you have a new Pharaoh, you have a new Moses, you think the new Moses is going to bring deliverance, but actually Jeroboam builds a golden calf, right? So he's a foil to Moses. He doesn't actually bring deliverance, he brings the people into idolatry. He doesn't do what he should be doing. Or think of we don't have time to develop that. So there's these images and symbols that keep showing up. It's typological in a sense, right? You keep seeing like the Jeroboam-Rehoboam story it's a promise of a new Exodus, but the new Exodus doesn't happen. Which is why when Jesus comes and he says that in the Transfiguration, Moses and Jesus talk about the Exodus. His coming Exodus is how Luke describes it. Jesus fulfills these patterns of Exodus stories. Within imagery, let's consider another one. So anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms. Anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms. In short, the anthropomorphisms are ascribing human body parts to God to communicate an idea about God. And they can't be taken literally because God is spirit, right? So we talk about the arm of God or the hands of God or the eyes of God or the feet of God. God doesn't literally have feet. God doesn't literally have eyes. God doesn't have a nose. Right, so when we talk about the nostrils of the Lord, things like that, God doesn't literally have these qualities. Rather, it helps us to understand what God is like, to use these qualities to describe him. Or for instance, or another way of thinking about it is, like we talked about in our first class, that God gave us eyes so that we would know that he's a seeing God. God gave us feet so we would know that he has feet that run throughout the earth, so we would understand his omniscience, right? Omnipresence. God is everywhere, and so he gave us feet so that we would know that he runs to and fro throughout the earth. So those are anthropomorphisms. God is spirit, so he doesn't have a body, he doesn't have eyes, he doesn't have feet, he doesn't have a nose. Anthropopathisms, though, would be describing emotional changes to God. Emotional changes to God, which shouldn't be taken literally also. Because God doesn't experience changes. He doesn't experience emotional changes. He's utterly consistent. He is who he is. All of his emotions are consistent. God always, you'll talk about this in your theology proper course, but this is the doctrine of divine impassibility, right? So God's love is not an emotion where his heart flutters, and then he's filled with love, and that emotion of love just fills him up, and so he goes and he does something based upon the emotion of love. No, God always perfectly feels his love. Just like God always perfectly feels his anger, God always perfectly feels faithfulness or justice or things like that. God is not a person in whom his emotions rise and fall, and that's what determines what he does. But when we look at the actions of God, oftentimes those actions are described in emotional terms as if one of his emotions was seen at the forefront above others. But because God's emotions are divine perfections, we can't say that this is true. That'd be quite a scary thing if we think about God's wrath overpowering his love, as if things could happen to him, causing his one emotion to rise to the top, and then all of a sudden he's overcome by that emotion. So 1 Samuel 15 is a good example of this. Let's go there. 1 Samuel 15, verse 11, which says this, I regret, this is God speaking, I regret that I have made Saul king. I regret that I've made Saul king. Now look at verse 25. The Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. But contrast that to verse 29. Okay, in the same chapter, right? Smack between the two. The glory of Israel will not have regret, for he is not man that he should have regret. So did God regret or did God not regret? The text says both. So how are we meant to read this? I think it's helpful through the category of anthropopathisms, right? So here's what didn't happen, right? The Lord is not like man that he should have regret. God didn't just look down one day and see that Saul was a bad king, and he's filled with regret, and so what do you do when you're filled with regret? You try to destroy things, and you try to cover it up, and you try to make it look like it never, ever happened in the first place. You try to make it as if this had never happened, right? That's a helpful way to think about what God is doing. God is doing something with Saul that's like what humans do when they feel regret, right? But God doesn't feel regret like we do. Not only because the text says this, but because what do you need for you to experience the emotion of regret? You not only need a body, which God doesn't have, but you also need to not know with certainty how things will work out. Or to not have foresight into the consequences of your actions, right? We have regret when we do something, and then after we do it, there are consequences that we didn't think about, or we do it and there was an outcome that we weren't expecting. That's what makes us feel regret, which God can't. God can't experience that. So like Genesis 6:6, when God regrets that he makes mankind on the earth, I think it's similar to that, right? The Lord can't regret, but what he does is best described as though he was regretting. He's starting all over, right? But he doesn't. But it wasn't like God was in heaven. He's like, I wish I had never done that. That was a dumb thing to do. Like, of course, God wasn't doing that, so he wasn't regretting like we regret. But his actions are best understood as though he's regretting. Does that make sense? We talk more about that in your Theology Proper course, about divine impassibility. It's one of my favorite doctrines of God. Okay, if not, we'll keep on going. No, we're going quickly because these aren't, in my mind, these are good for you to be aware of as categories, but they're not as important for Christ-centered hermeneutics. These are just ways to understand what the text is saying. So just to have these categories in mind. So simile and metaphor. Simile and metaphor. So you'll find this a lot of times in poetry. So a simile is when we make a comparison using the words like or as. We make a comparison using the words like or as. So Psalm 1 verse 3. Which says, he is like a tree planted by streams of water. Not he is a tree, but he is like a tree planted by streams of water, right? Can you think of a metaphor in the Psalms? Maybe one we looked at earlier today? Yeah, the Lord is my shepherd. The Lord's not like a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, right? So that's a comparison without using like or as. And this is important to understand these categories of simile and metaphor, because what we don't want to do is stretch them too far or make them say things they're not intended to say. That they need to only say things that the author intended them to say when he wrote it. So for instance, Psalm 18 verse 31. Who is God? For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except for our God? How is God like a rock? Strong, stable, indestructible, dependable. How is he not like a rock? He's not made up of minerals, right? So you say the Lord is a rock. You're not trying to say that he's made up of material things, or that if you put enough pressure on him, he'll collapse, or that kids have fun throwing him around, right? That's not what we're saying. Or you can throw it through a window and break a window, right? So you have to understand the meaning of the metaphor or the meaning of the simile and what the author is trying to communicate with that. So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. How is he similar to a shepherd? What's he trying to communicate? He cares. What else? He keeps. He provides. But it's not trying to say he's stinky, right? Or he lives in fields, or his best friends are sheep and not people, right? That's not what's being said. Right? These are silly examples, but you have to understand what the image means. What's the author trying to communicate with the image, and what's he not trying to communicate with the image? Does that make sense? Okay, let's then go to chiasms. Chiasm. So these are everywhere in the Bible. It's a literary device. It's a literary. It's a way of writing that we don't really think about today very much. We don't think about chiasms, but the biblical authors thought a lot about chiasms. There are chiasms everywhere in Scripture. They're very easy to find, especially within poetry sections, but even narrative sections. There's chiasms everywhere. It's based off of the Greek letter chi, which you all know because you had to write it today for your quiz, right? And the structure then of the narrative or the poem starts broad, and then it narrows so that what happens in the very middle is the most important section, right? So, and it's oftentimes marked out with A and A prime, B and B prime, C and C prime, and so forth, right, as I have on your screen. So for here, whoever sheds, and then it ends with sheds, the blood, shall his blood, of man and by man. So the most important idea in the poem is man, right? We're talking about people, which then draws to mind the idea of the image of God and draws to mind the fact that man is the climax of God's creation. The most important thing is not the shedding, right? As if we're talking about shedding blood, but we're not talking about, strangling, or we're not talking about, any other kinds of ways of killing, poisoning, things like that. Right? That's not the point. If you're reading it, you're missing the main point. The main point is not blood. So that if you kill someone in ways outside of blood, now I've gotten away. No, the main point is that we're talking about people made in the image of God, and that's reflected in the very structure of the text itself. So let's look at a couple other examples. So Matthew 23:12, whoever exalts himself, that's A prime, will be exalted. Whoever exalts himself, A, and then A prime will be exalted. Whoever will be humbled is then paralleled with whoever humbles himself. So the main idea of the passage is the importance of humility. The main idea of the passage is the importance of humility. So here's what I want to do. You'll see this in bigger sections. So I want to give you a moment. This is in Joshua 1 through 5, which I think is a chiasm. So take a moment just to look at it and try to see where are the parallel phrases or the parallel ideas. So A and A prime, what's the parallel? Yeah, I'll be with you. I was with Moses, I'll be with you. What about B and B prime? Courage. Just courage and strength. C and C prime? Be careful to do. So then the main point of the text is don't let the book of the law depart from your mouth. The main point of the text is not being strong and courageous. The main point of the text is not being careful. The main point of the text is not even that God will be with him. The main point of the text is the book of the law should not depart from your mouth. Does that make sense? So that helps you when you're preaching also, if you know the main structure of the text. And it helps you to know what to focus on in the text. How does that connect to Christ then, if we know what the main idea of the text is? How do we connect that to Christ? Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, Jesus does this perfectly. None of us have done this perfectly, but Jesus does do it perfectly, right? He is, this Psalm 1 probably has this text in mind, right? So Jesus is the Psalm 1 man. Jesus is the Joshua 1 man, which means that Jesus is the better Joshua. Jesus is the better Moses, things like that. Good. Let's think about Romans chapter 3. I'm sorry, Psalm 51. So I think Psalm 51 is a chiasm as well. Take a look. Do you see the similarities? So David's main concern in the text is that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgments. Okay, I think that's the main concern. David's main concern is not even about his experience. The main concern for David is God, right? That tells us a lot about the idea of confession of sins, I think. But I think this is the structure, or the chiasm. So, blot out my transgressions, blot out my iniquities, wash me, cleanse me, I will be clean. I know and teach me. I sinned and was brought forth in iniquity, and sinned that my mother conceived me. Now, they don't have to be 100% parallel. There can be progression in it, right? So there's progression in the I know that I have sinned and I was brought forth in iniquity, right? So there's poetry there. It's I did something wrong and I was born with a sin nature, right? The idea of knowing his transgressions, and then the idea of being taught how to live a right life, right? So that would be progressions within the chiastic structure itself. Yeah, Shaq. Yeah, you're supposed to figure it out. So for us, this is like a brand new way of like reading, but for the Jews, like they just like it's happening so often that they just saw it, you know. But it also is an encouragement to meditate on God's word day and night, right? Because not everything is clear on the first reading. Daniel 6 follows a similar chiastic structure. So it starts with Daniel's success. And he's exalted and brought into Darius's council. And it ends with his success as well, where he's exalted above the false Daniels, or the ones who are going against him. Darius signs a decree at the beginning and the end. Daniel has opponents who seek to orchestrate his demise, and that's paralleled with Daniel's opponent meeting their demise, right? So they try to set up so Daniel will fall in the lion's den, but they're the one who fall in the lion's den. And then the very middle, the center of it is Darius seeing that God delivered. He's waiting, and then he sees God deliverance. So the main idea of the text is waiting for and seeing God delivering and rescuing his people. And you're seeing it through the eyes of Darius. The Noah story, I think, follows something similar as well. So the very center of the Noah flood story is God remembering Noah. But it starts with Noah and his sons. It ends with Noah and his sons. Corruption of all flesh, covenant with all flesh. God's resolution to destroy the earth. God says that he will never destroy the earth again, and so forth. So the very center is God remembering Noah, surrounded by the rising of the waters and the flooding and the going down of the waters. So you'll see this everywhere. You'll see this across entire books of the Bible. You'll see it in even collections of Psalms. So like Psalms 2 through, if my memory serves, Psalms 2 through 12, I think, is a chiasm as well, I think. So you'll see this throughout. You'll see this everywhere in the Bible once you start to look for it. Oh yeah, you see it in the New Testament as well. Yep. You see it mostly in the Old, but you do see it in the New as well.